She had her stress test, and she's going to have to go back for another appointment tomorrow. Somebody didn't like what they saw and said there was something abnormal about her stress test. So she is trying to get in to see the doctor as quickly as possible, and that is going to be tomorrow. So we'll keep you posted as we hear anything about that. But appreciate your prayers for them. Keep praying for them. They're supposed to go on vacation next week. This is exactly the kind of news you want to worry about, right? So they're desperately trying to get in and should be able to see the doctor tomorrow. Appreciate that very much. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21. We remember last week Abraham had a little lapse. He had an issue with Abimelech and telling him that Sarah was his sister. And he ended up looking kind of foolish with that. All the excuses that he made. And it was a good lesson for us. We often find ourselves in those same spots, struggling with the same things, trying to justify ourselves, and just really having struggle with confession, getting it right, keeping it right. All that to say, Abraham was a good man of faith. Abraham believes God's promises, and yet the Bible is honest that even men who are struggle at times. Okay, so we appreciate the Bible's honesty about our character, about our nature, and what we need. Even as we come to faith in Christ, there's still a lot of work left to be done on us, isn't there? Sanctification is a lifelong process. Until we leave this world, until we get new bodies in glorification, there's always something to work on. Chapter 21 comes. Abraham, of course, has been given God's great promises, several of them in previous chapters. And tonight, finally, you begin to see their fulfillment. In chapter 21, let's look at this first thought, and that is that Isaac is born. Isaac is born. In verse 1, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him." Now, in those first two verses, you have three things that are mentioned, three things of repeated emphasis. Were you able to make out what it was? Three times it tells you what? That God did what he said he was going to do. Now, it's been a long time. It's been 25 years since the first promise came. And you and I kind of look at time, and we've talked about it a little bit, about how time is restrictive to us, or we think that time does away with promises. We think that time makes things less reliable, and yet God's word is absolutely true. The Bible tells us twice in verse number 1 that not only did God do what he said he would do, verse 2 tells us that the time was appropriate. The time was exactly what God had in mind and what he had said to Abraham. Look at that again. He visited Sarah as he had said. He did unto Sarah as he had spoken. And Sarah conceived at the time of which God had spoken. So three times again, God did what he promised to do. Their stumbling didn't change that. Abraham's lapses didn't change that. The running ahead of the Lord and having a child with Hagar didn't change that. The promises that God made were unconditional. And God has come through and begun now to fulfill those promises. God's word can be trusted. God's promises can be trusted. Even when the timing is not necessarily ours, you read through these first couple of verses and we are reminded that God does what he says he will do. Now in verse 3 it says that Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him Isaac, whom Sarah bare unto him Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So where you see God's faithfulness in verse numbers 1 and 2, what do you see in verse 3 and 4? You see Abraham's obedience. You remember from chapter 17 verse 19 said, God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. God gave Abraham 2 commands in Genesis chapter 17. One of them dealt with the subject of circumcision, that Abraham and those in his house and those that would come after him were to be circumcised. And secondly, when he has a son of his own flesh with Sarah, he is supposed to name him Isaac. You know what the Bible tells us here in Genesis 21, verse 3 and 4? Both things that God had commanded, Abraham did. He names him Isaac. Of course, that name means laughter. And that's always going to bring into their mind the times that God had made promises and the times that God had said what he would do, and they laughed. Whether they laughed at times in hopeful joy, or whether they laughed in curious doubt, Isaac, even in his name, even in the name laughter, would be a reminder that they had once laughed, and they would continue to laugh. We're going to see that here in this next passage. But again, he is obedient. In verse 5, it says, Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born unto him. He's not young. And it's been at least 25 years since he came into this land. So Abraham has lived a quarter of his life hearing God promise things, right? He's lived 25% of his life hearing God promise, you're going to have a son. You're going to have a son. I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to establish my covenant with your seed. All of these promises he's heard God make. And now he starts to see them come to pass. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh. She had once laughed, potentially in doubt, but now God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. The joy that Sarah had would be shared by others. It's interesting that God can take a rebuke and actually turn it into an occasion for joy. Sarah continues to laugh. And she continues to, she'll continue to laugh in the name Isaac. And yet it's absolutely for a different reason this time. Verse 7, she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Sarah laughs now in just the thought of the joy that she has and the joy that others are going to have when they get to hear this news. Because they even say, who would have thought this was possible? Who would have said in verse number 7, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? Who would have ever said, yep, I think Sarah, now's about the time she's going to start to bear children. Nobody would have thought this. She's well past childbearing age, and she's 90 years old plus now. And who would have ever thought this? Now that's the benefit, right, of trusting God, of believing God. It's now knowing that no one would have thought that. You see, the birth of Isaac gives Abraham and Sarah opportunity to talk about what God has done. God would have gotten all the credit from this, because now Sarah, laughing, understands, how was this even possible? How did this happen? Nobody would have ever believed this. If I'm going to tell people this, and if I didn't actually have Isaac to show them, no one would have believed this was possible. And so she'll bear that smile, she'll bear that laughter, that joy of being able to tell people an unbelievable story. My son, you don't have a son. You're 90-something years old, and be able to show Isaac and be able to talk about him, be able to talk about God's faithfulness to his promises. God would have gotten the credit here. And listen, when people hear our stories, it's important that we emphasize what God did to make these things possible in our lives. The joy that we have, the blessings that we have in this world and in this life, it is important that we emphasize that it was only possible because of what God has done for us. Sarah didn't make this happen. Sarah didn't achieve this of her own flesh, of her own ability. But with joy now, she's going to be able to tell people that nobody, you wouldn't believe this if I didn't have him standing right here to show you. But God gave me a son. And that's why she's able to say that God hath made me to laugh, and so that all that hear will laugh with me. Let your story give God the credit, and let the story of the joy that God has brought into our lives be shared with others so that they can joy in it as well. This is a great story here of Isaac being born. God has come now and begun to keep his promises. Thus far, Abraham has known God as a promise maker. Now he starts to see God as a promise keeper. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. Great story there as Isaac is born. Now, number 2, after Isaac is born, let's look at Sarah and the bondwoman. Sarah and the bondwoman. Now, not long, I'm guessing, as it describes for us there, the weaning of Isaac in verse number 8, it's obvious from the culture and the habits of the time. Isaac was close to mom for those early years. That's the way that works. But now, as he's been weaned, notice what it says in verse number 9. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. As soon as he gets past this period of being weaned, Sarah actually spots Isaac and Ishmael out one day, and Ishmael is making fun of him in some way. He's mocking him, according to verse number 9. Now, it doesn't tell us what he's saying. Is he ridiculing him? I was Dad's favorite until you came along. Or was he poking? I mean, listen, there's 16 years in difference in age. They're not close in age. I'm not sure that they were close friends or buddies, but whatever it was that had happened, Sarah sees Ishmael mocking her son. And then mama bear tendency kicks in, and she gets real mad. Look at verse number 10. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. I mean, when Sarah sees it, she flips out. Like, Abraham, you got to do something about this. They got to go. This house ain't big enough for all of us, okay? They're going to have to go. Isaac's growing, and conflict seems inevitable. And Abraham, I think it's just time that you go ahead and send Hagar and her son on their way. We're not going to be able to keep both Isaac and Ishmael under the same roof anymore. And that actually, from verse number 11, it says the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. Abraham has to struggle with this a little bit. You know why? Because both boys are his sons. He's had Ishmael for 16 plus years now. Even if Isaac's anywhere from an age like 3 to 5, when he was weaned, you're talking about a young man now at this point that Ishmael was. And Sarah's come in and made a demand that he's got to go. Hagar and Ishmael, they have to go. They are not going to be able to coexist in the same household. One of them has to go. And Abraham was feeling it. Now notice what it says there in verse 10. Cast out this bondwoman and her son. This friction that existed in the house of Abraham is actually going to become a topic that Paul later uses in the scripture to describe something else. Now let's turn over there and we're going to read that. In Galatians chapter 4, in the book of Galatians, Paul is dealing with the churches of Galatia, and then specifically some of the Jewish legalists who had troubled them. That they were also they too were the children of Abraham, and by their merits and by the merits of the law and by their obedience, had an equal claim. Let's read what it says here. In Galatians chapter 4, and in verse 22, it says, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was after the flesh." Now that's right, wasn't it? How did Ishmael come into this world? That was strictly a matter of the flesh, right? They didn't wait on the promise of God. That was not the promised seed, the promised child that God had gave. The birth of Ishmael was something that Abraham and Sarah concocted on their own and under their own intentions and with their own flesh. So that's true. He who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. You and I know that that's also true. Isaac being born to Abraham and Sarah was not of their flesh. They're old people at this point. This has only come because of the promise of God. They believe God's promises. God gives them a child. This child was given to them as that promise. So those are the two children, right? Ishmael, symbolic of those things that are done in the flesh and accomplished by the flesh. And Isaac, the child who is acquired by promise, by gift. Verse 24, Paul is going to use that family dynamic of Abraham's household as an explanation that even trickles down into the idea of salvation. Look at verse 24. "These things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar, or Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of the promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so is it now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scriptures? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free." This concept here, the friction that was in Abraham's home, Paul is going to later use as he deals with a bunch of legalists that want to deal with this subject of law versus grace, law versus faith and the promise. The Galatians, or the Jewish legalists in Galatia who had troubled the Galatians, it says here in this passage. We're the children of Abraham. Paul argues, yeah, you can be a child of Abraham, but not necessarily be Isaac, right? I mean, Abraham had two sons. One was accomplished strictly by the flesh. One was accomplished by the promise. Works or promise. And here's the thing. Paul notes that just as they were incompatible back then, so those two concepts are still incompatible now. Did you know that? Did you know that law and grace, they're not compatible? If you're trying to earn salvation through the works of the law, that's not compatible with grace. And if your trust is in the promise of God, if by faith you've experienced the grace of God in salvation, that's not compatible with this concept of fleshly acquirement, of works. Those two don't go together. So just as they were incompatible then, they still are. Law and grace don't mix. What Paul would tell the legalists there in Galatia was, what you have is not the same. We're the children of Abraham as well, and the salvation that someone has that they acquired by faith is just the same salvation that maybe somebody believes they acquired by works. Paul says, no, what you have is not the same. Okay? Abraham had 2 sons. You can claim, there's much that you can claim, but these 2 thoughts are incompatible. And that friction that lasted in Abraham's home when Sarah says, you're going to have to cast out this bondwoman, Paul talks about that to these churches in Galatia. You have to get rid of this. These 2 concepts can't mix. These 2 concepts are not compatible. This idea of law and grace. If we're going to teach people the doctrine of salvation, guess what it is? It's either works or it's grace. And this idea that you can mix those and mingle those, you're going to end up with as much trouble in this church or in this home as Abraham had in his. Those 2 ideas don't mix. Paul also argued that when people have a problem with this, or when there's friction with it and there's persecution that goes along with it, it usually flows one way. He looks there in verse number 29 when he says, but as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Did you know that if there's ever persecution, if there's ever bickering or fighting over this doctrine, you know who usually is the aggressor? It's the one that's fleshly. It's the one that's promoting those things being done by the flesh. Paul says, just as the persecution went from Ishmael to Isaac, he said that's the way it still works. But these 2 ideas aren't compatible. Okay? I just think that that's interesting, right? We're reading in the Old Testament a story of friction in Abraham's home, and how Sarah realizes, no, we cannot all exist under one roof. And Paul later takes that and is able to build on the doctrine of salvation and say, listen, just as Abraham and his family had 1 child that came by means of the flesh and 1 child that came by means of the promise, Galatia, you're struggling with these ideas of how to mix the fleshly works of the law and that spirit of grace and promise. You can't mix those. As much as you're trying, as much as you are attempting to mingle those ideas together, one of them's got to go. You got to cast it out. He even uses the same language, cast out the bondwoman. All right, Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21. Now, Sarah had already tried to get rid of Hagar once, right? We remember that story. Now, it's even more personal because she's seen Ishmael mocking her son, and she absolutely wants them gone. And it bothers Abraham. But notice what it says in verse 12. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad and because of thy bondwoman. And all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called, and also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. And though he was grieved, the Lord comes to Abraham in comfort and says, Abraham, don't be grieved. What Sarah has said to do, let do that. Go ahead. It's time. And he actually gives a 2-fold reason here. First of all, in verse number 12, it's because Isaac is the son of promise. What God's plans are specifically in the keeping of his promise and the development of this covenant, it's going to go through Isaac. And the friction in the home as God develops Isaac into the young man that he is and takes over the covenant through him, it's going to be better. It's going to be better to just, yes, allow Ishmael and Hagar to go. Of course, the second reason is it says in verse 13 that Ishmael's going to be a mighty nation. God's not abandoning, he's not abandoning Ishmael. God still has a plan for Ishmael. He's going to make of him a mighty nation. He is your seed, Abraham. He is your son. Yes, through Isaac come all the promises of the covenant, but I also told Abraham that I would make of him great and mighty nation. Kings multiple and princes multiple would come from him, and part of that's going to be realized in Ishmael. So as discouraged as Abraham is, God does tell him in verse 12 and 13, yes, in all that Sarah has said, hearken unto her voice. It's time to send them on. So verse 14, Abraham rose up early in the morning, took bread, a bottle of water, and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away. And she departed, and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. You say, that sounds kind of harsh. And maybe physically and in the flesh as we look at it, it is. I actually think that it's interesting, though, and some commentators note this. What happens in verse 14, though, is almost reflective of how much Abraham does trust God. We remember that Abraham's not a poor man, right? Abraham has plenty. He has plenty of animals. He has plenty of supply. We're actually going to be able to see that in the next passage when he gives a bunch of lambs to someone else. He doesn't send Hagar and Ishmael out with any of those things. You know what it says in verse number 14? He sends them with some bread and a bottle of water. And it's almost reflective of Abraham trusting God to take care of them. Abraham could have given them anything. Abraham could have sent them out with animals. He could have sent them out with supply. He could have sent them out with servants. But when God said, Abraham, I'll make of him a mighty nation, Abraham is trusting God to take care of them. When he sends Ishmael away, he's sending him with God's promise to make of him a mighty nation. If Ishmael is sustained, if Ishmael grows, if Ishmael does become a mighty nation, it's not going to be this time because Abraham made it happen. It's going to be because God keeps his word and because God keeps his promise. So when you look at verse 14, and it doesn't look like he sent them out with very much at all, right? Bread and a bottle of water. Don't neglect that there's likely a good amount of faith in Abraham trusting God to keep them and take care of them better than anything that he could have done in sending with them. Now, obviously, a bottle of water doesn't last long. Verse 15 says the water was spent in the bottle, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. You know, as I'm sure it didn't take long for the water to run out, and Hagar pushes or lets down or sets aside the child under one of the shrubs, finds a shady spot where she can have Ishmael lie down. That's kind of like a mom to do that, right? Give the child the shady spot. And in verse 16 it says, and she went, she sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot, for she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. Hagar fully assumes that they're both going to die soon. Now, God had promised to make of him a mighty nation, but Hagar lays him down under this shady spot and then takes a walk to where she can die and he can die and she doesn't have to see it. And she fully assumes that's what's going to happen. But if you notice in verse 17, God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, what aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. God responds. God hears, of course, the cry of the lad. God reaffirms. God confirms again his promise, his intention to make of Ishmael a mighty nation, to make of him a great nation. Doesn't mean, again, that Ishmael is going to inherit all the promises of Isaac. And we know that one of the promises dealing with Ishmael, that he was going to be a wild man, that every man's hand would be against him and his hand against every man. Ishmael's not necessarily going to be a great man of character himself, but God promised to make of him a mighty nation, and God was not going to abandon his promise under a shrub in the wilderness. Okay? So he hears his cry, he raises him up, has a plan for him. God opened her eyes in verse 19, and she saw a well of water. She went, filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. And so goes on the story of Ishmael. We won't hear too much about him again because the Bible's going to focus on the promised seed and on the story of Abraham and Isaac. But you are to take from that and draw from that continue. When God makes a promise, he keeps it. And Abraham, casting Ishmael and Hagar out of his home and allowing them to go off into the wilderness, God was not done. God was going to continue to keep his word and fulfill his promise. God's promise to Isaac and to Ishmael are both going to be fulfilled. Now, lastly, in this chapter you see, thirdly, Abraham at Beersheba. Abraham at Beersheba. Verse 22, it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now, nobody knows exactly who this is. Most people that you'll read will note that Abimelech is likely more of a title than it actually is of a person's name. There's no guarantee, and most people don't think that this Abimelech is the same Abimelech that's mentioned in the previous passage or in a later passage. But whoever he is, notice what he recognizes as he is in this land. And this chief captain, notice what they notice about Abraham. Verse 22, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now listen, that is the greatest blessing of all that Abraham has. And he's got cattle, and he's got animals, and he's got servants, and he's got everything materially that you could want. And yet, isn't it the greatest blessing to be able to recognize that God is with thee in all that thou doest? That's even more valuable than things. That's more valuable than material possessions, is for this man to look at Abraham and recognize this man's got the presence of God. And because he has the presence of God, because he recognizes that God is with Abraham, this man realizes how important it is to remain on good terms with Abraham, right? You know, if God's for somebody, it's not really a good idea for you to be against them. You probably ought to make friends of people that are in good favor with God. Make good friends of people that are good friends with the Lord. Notice what it says in verse 22 or verse 23. Now therefore swear unto me here by God that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. No, notice that. You and me, we're on the same page, right? Can we just commit and plan right now that we're going to do right by each other? You know, that's wise. When he recognizes, you know what, God is with this man. God is with this man. God's presence is with him, and all that he doest. I probably ought to stay on the same page as Abraham. I probably ought to align or alliance myself with him. In verse 24, Abraham said, I will swear. Okay, young people, hear that. Make friends with God's people. Okay? Make friends with people that you can look at their life and recognize God's presence in their life. Recognize that they're people of faith, that the things of God are important to them. And when you see people that are like that in this world, don't make enemies of them. Make friends of them. Make friends with people that have God's presence in their life. You'll be better off for it, just as Abimelech was here. Now there's a little bit of conflict, but it's going to be settled here. Notice this in verse 25. Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. Well, now that we're on the same page, and now that we're friends, we kind of got to settle this issue. I dug a well, and I think some of your men kind of seized it, kind of took it over. In verse 26, Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me yet, neither yet heard I of it, but today. Man, I don't know nothing about it. This is the first I've heard about this. And so what does Abraham do? It says in verse 27, Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves, And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, For these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Abraham is willing to take, Abraham's not greedy by any means, and he takes 7 ewe lambs, and he's willing to present them as, okay, I tell you what, I dug this well, and it belongs to me, but I tell you what, let's come to an agreement here, and I'm going to give you these lambs. You take these lambs, okay? That'll be payment. We'll come to an agreement. I'll give you these lambs. You recognize this is my well. I dug this well. It's for us. And that's pretty good conflict resolution, right? To be able to calmly come through this conflict. Hey, your men seized this well. Abraham could have acted violently, could have acted mad. Well, that would kind of go against the purpose of everything that was just said in verse 23 when you make a covenant. There are some people that claim to be friends, but then you look at them and the way that they bicker and the way that they fight and the way that they argue and the way that they talk about each other, you wouldn't believe they were friends. And yet Abraham has made a covenant, he's made an agreement, and right away he recognizes, okay, we're going to be on the same page. We got to settle this issue. And Abraham's willing to give a little and willing to work through this conflict. And it's just a real calm way of showing us. Abraham is growing into a reliable, godly man with good qualities and characteristics. Conflict resolution is hard. Abraham's kind of piecing some things together, though. And let's close with verse 32 down to the end. They made a covenant at Beersheba. That name is going to become important. Okay, the place of Beersheba is going to be important later in the scripture. Wherefore he called, verse 31, that place Beersheba, because they swear both of them, and they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba, and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the Philistines' land many days. He called on the name of the Lord. All this land was his. It's the Philistines' land, but this is actually going to ultimately be part of the land of promise. And Abraham sojourns there. But everywhere he goes, Abraham begins to call upon the name of the Lord. When he was going to have a spot in Bethel for a while, what does he do? He builds an altar there, and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And now that he's come down to Beersheba, which in the future is going to be really one of the southern boundaries, one of the marks of the southern boundaries in the nation of Israel, what does he do? He gets there and he finds a place where he can call upon the name of the Lord. Abraham roamed this land without having an ultimate settling down spot. And yet everywhere that he went, he found a place to pray, to call upon the name of the Lord, and to worship him. And that's a good lesson for us as well. Abraham, it says in verse 33, he called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Abraham has started to see some of God's promises come to fruition. It's real to him now. He's able to see that the God that promises is the God that comes through. And in verse 33, we are introduced to the Lord, a name of his as the everlasting God. And that's a blessing. All right. Let's go ahead and we'll close with a word of prayer there.